have are these kinds of emotional and sociological, cultural ways of evaluating them. Okay, so I'll go back to Milford's. Now, this kind of explosion of information is associated with these kinds of claims, which you'll sometimes see lying around the net. This one, I think, was compiled by a guy named Martin Reich. This is a more or less random selection of claims about like how much information we absorb compared to some person in the past. And one of the curious things about this is you see one of the main functions of information apparently is that it's a license to manufacture bullshit, like on the spot, to say whatever you want. And pick up pick up some poor average medieval peasant or a person from a tribal society or a 19th century citizen or a typical adult from 1892, not 1893. 1892 is totally different, as in fact it was, because there was a financial crisis. But anyway, picking up these poor people like they're rag dolls and hurling them around in this sort of neurotic discourse, right? Now another one of these kinds of compilations, I think that actually this is the one from Martin Reich. When he talks about, how quickly our knowledge is doubling. Now, if any of you have a basic grasp of math, and you start doing this doubling exercise, you'll very quickly find that you consume more energy than there is in the entire universe, doubling your knowledge within the next 4 years. It just doesn't work. This is nonsense. One of the main proponents of these kinds of claims is a guy named Richard Saul Wurman, who you don't know, and yet you do, because he was the founder of the TED conferences, which are these sort of vertiginous, exciting moments where you have no idea what's going on, but it's really, really, really crazy, and there's experts, and you can't participate. It's just like a baseball stadium, and so you sit and watch. If you're a middle-aged, overweight white guy with a corporate expense account to pay for your presence there. Otherwise, you can go to hell. Like many of the people working in this field, and I'll go through some of them, is the history of people who are advocates of information design and data visualization in form are usually con men, impresarios, lunatics, utopians, and dystopians. Basically, every major figure in this field is kind of a nut. That's why I talk about it. So, anyway, now I'm going to return a little bit to what some of what we've been talking about in this class. Here is this thing that you may remember that Jamer showed, which is this brilliant exercise in scaling, right? Very wonderful. It's narrated by a very soothing voice of, by the way, I can't remember the man's name. He was a physicist who participated in the Trinity tests. He was actually the guy who drove the plutonium core from Los Alamos to the Trinity explosion site. And then later in his life, dedicated himself to the anti-nuclear movement. And his participation as the narrator for this film was very much of a piece with this kind of reevaluation of his life's work. And so we see again that there's a certain kind of historical crisis. Now, the thing that we're doing is, in theory, right here, we're sort of operating on this kind of vertical axis. But as we go farther and farther and farther out to space, and you start to consider the Earth rotating, the galaxies rotating, and all of this rotating, you'll see that what looks like this very orderly procession is actually sort of like, it's complete madness if you really sort of trace what it is. And so what you'll see on some level is a kind of a masking of what this trajectory really is. Okay. People like to credit the Aineses with this, but in fact they basically either bought or stole or something the idea from this Dutch guy named, I don't think there's no one here who speaks Flemish or Dutch better than I, Kees Boeke. Good. Okay, not so bad. Anyway, who wrote a book, I think, in 1957 about this. Boeke was a quite fantastic character, a very devout Mennonite who was very dedicated to educational reform and of a very sort of democratizing kind, who was lucky enough or smart enough to marry an heiress to the Cadbury fortune and then take that money and use it toward his ends, which included educating the children of the Dutch aristocracy. So he made this book, which I think is probably a masterpiece. It truly should be credited as a masterpiece of graphic design, because here you can see everything from kind of like life drawing to political geography to sort of scientific representation to sort of almost like pure abstraction, unified, these different sort of ways of looking at the work, unified in a single book with this really sort of magisterial procession. It is a masterpiece of elegance, right? There are deeper roots to this notion of scaling that we need to examine. We can't simply accept the discourse of scaling. We need to look at where it comes from and where it's going. And this is one of the main places that it comes from. It's also important to remember the Powers of 10 first came out in 1968. And by that time, notions of scaling had already become camp. So for example, 11 years before this quite fantastic film, The Incredible Shrinking Man, which like other films, some other films of the period, like The Nutty Professor, is a brilliant meditation on the kind of diminution of masculine power in America in the wake of the post-war, in the wake of World War II. All these men had run off on the road fighting, women had flooded into the workplace, and were not going to be shoved back in so easily. And so Hollywood was desperately sort of trying to struggle with how to do this, and came up, as it often does, with these brilliant representations of a guy who is mysteriously radiated and then shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and has some marital problems, as you could imagine. This is a shot from showing some of the special effects of it, and it's completely fantastic. So, on the one hand, for 10 years, this had already basically been kind of camp pop discourse. On the other hand, a year before that film came out, a year before the Ames film came out, Monsanto, the guys who had brought you DDT and Agent Orange and a couple other stuff, collaborated with Disney to produce a scientific wonder. It's called A Journey Through Adventure in Inner Space. I remember it fondly from when I was a child. This is what you heard on this ride.
Man had but his own 2 eyes to explore the wonders of his world. Then he invented the microscope, a mighty eye, and discovered the fantastic universe beyond the limits of his own meager sight. Now your adventure through inner space has begun. Through the mighty microscope, you will travel into the incredible universe found within a tiny fragment of a snowflake.
The snippets of what you saw, so great.
I am the first person to make this fabulous journey. Suspended in the timelessness of inner space are the thought waves of my first impressions. They will be our...
Okay, you get the idea. Anyway, I'm going to have to hasten this along. The other thing to note that's kind of odd about the Ames's film is that the initial version of it that was kind of released in 1968 started off in Miami, which also was the home of the RNC, the Republican National Convention, which was the site of a really, really fantastic and terrifying demonstration by the Vietnam veterans against war. And in retrospect, may not have been the wisest choice for IBM and the Ames's to sort of like present this kind of, this masterpiece of scaling starting from a place that's relatively neutral. So when they subsequently released the film, in 1977, they decided to move the location from Miami to Chicago, which had been the home of the Democratic National Convention in the same year. And again, that didn't go so well. This was really sort of like the moment that tipped the 60s into something approaching the sort of early 70s. So, as I say, so much for scaling, right? So, the point of this all is to sort of try to situate this kind of scientific, sort of, quantitative, mathematical discourse in sort of a deeper social field. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. This is one of my favorite quotations ever from Moby Dick, which I recommend that you read in your spare time. If you don't read that, at least read chapter 65, The Whale Has a Dish, which is totally great. I'll let you absorb this for a second. Talking about a guy who is using an animal for light, for food, and for everything else in a sort of vain quest to catch it, and failing miserably. Stubb is a little bit different from Ahab, but anyway. Okay, now to the Falling Man edition. We've been very lucky in this last week or so to see one of the most amazing spectacles of the past many years, this lunatic jumping out of a Red Bull-sponsored balloon, right? This is unbelievable. And the reason that I was thinking about this was I've been thinking very intently about this kind of vertical axis, this sort of scaling axis, and I keep on saying like, no abstraction, let's bring it back. And I thought, this guy did a better job of that than anyone else. He was going up 120,000 feet and jumping, right? What's odd is that we associate that with technology, but of course he's not the first guy to do it. He beat the record of the last guy to do it, who did it in 1960. Do you guys know what BAMF stands for? Bad ass. This guy's it. Very, very, very little technology. This is before there was duct tape. And you can see, I don't know, the sick stuff is held together on his butt with masking tape or something. Completely fantastic. Joe Kidding, a superhero, right? And you can literally see, even in, you can see the sewing, you can see the stitching, you can see a world that this was not primarily facilitated by computational culture. This was done by a very different way of thinking about math, most of which was analog and involved things like slide rules. You guys should look those up on Wikipedia. But this discourse of this sort of of this sort of rising and falling goes back, as far as I know, 2,500 years or so. This is a medieval or late medieval engraving of a play by Aristophanes called The Clouds, which is done in 423 BC, and it depicts Socrates sitting in a basket, being hoisted aloft. Socrates, I had to cut a whole part out here about my advisor in ancient studies and how I know this. If you read through the lines in Plato, you'll find that Socrates basically was convinced he was possessed by some kind of devil who granted him the ability to make these mystical ascents and see everything very clearly. Aristophanes thought that this was a little bit silly. So this notion of sort of rising and falling, it's strange. I mean, we can find it going back as far as philosophy itself. And we can also find sort of people taking the piss out of it as far back as philosophy goes. So, now onward, and this is going to be a little bit of an awkward break, I'm sorry. The person who's typically associated with the first sort of uses of data visualization to represent economic discourse as opposed to many others is William Playfair, who did it around the late 1800s. This is a sample of his work. I'm going to move through it, but that sudden dip is the American Revolution, bad for England. Right? And you can see that reflected in the titles of his books, which start out kind of, representing by means of stained copper plates the progress of commerce, revenues, expenditures. And then in the second one, he starts talking about every state and kingdom in Europe. And then in the third one, he starts talking about the US. And in the fourth one, he starts talking about decline and fall. You can see very much that he was concerned about the sort of the big picture of how things were going, and the titles of his books represent this. And these pictures of his work are often bandied about in this field. But he says very clearly in the first 3 or 4 pages of his book that he thinks that there is a world of pain coming, that there's going to be nothing but war, and he's trying to develop a transcultural, translinguistic, transhistorical way of representing data because we have a new Middle Ages upon us. It's typically the sign of a dystopian. He also says that he was, he wanted to know if he was the first person to ever do this, which is quite an amazing thing. You always have to watch out for charlatans who are asking, am I the first? Because it's strongly suggested probably they're not. And he says, no. Actually, people have been doing this in chronology for a long time. Okay, so what is chronology? Well, chronology is sort of classical, sort of pre-modern way of representing history. And they use things like timelines quite frequently, but they didn't really have a kind of a global perspective for them. And it is anything but technocratic, and so you'll find representations of history that take the form, for example, of a body, or rivers, or routes, or wheels, or even temples, right? These, in their own way, are very much data visualizations, but from a pre-informational culture. And the debt that data visualization owes to these sort of classical and explicitly religious ways of understanding history is very much masked, I think. I can't really go into how or why. We can trace it back even further into different ways of thinking about things. Robert Flood, super genius, who apparently, as you can see from the left, was aware before anyone else that human beings consisted of monkeys with different technical practices. So much for Darwin. But again, you'll see this sort of this reflection of sort of technical practice, human activity, and human cognition are all over his work. Completely fantastic stuff. Johannes Kepler, a very significant figure in the history of astronomy, who I'm particularly devoted to because his last name is my middle name. But again, we see this, this moment where it's everything from there's nothing going on here. That the Ameses, the Ameses are basically doing what he was doing, although his printing mechanisms and sort of, worked a little bit slower. So, and it doesn't stop. This is the first man, John Glenn, to go into outer space or something like that, I think?
First American.
First American, there you go. Oh, so much for my multiculturalism. Looking at this sort of, at this fantastic diagram in 1997 of political corruption, the Lippo group buying influence in campaigns. I'm moving this along fast. At the bottom, you can see in yellow, he's looking at it, he says, I'm a Cancer, where do I fit in? So as late as 1997, a man who had been into space and had seen all of this, he had seen more diagrams and more data visualizations than you could possibly imagine, is looking at one and sees that it's kind of like religious chicanery or something. It's completely incomprehensible. I'm going to drag this down into the sort of realm of a very practical. This is a corpse that was found somewhere, I think, outside of New York City at some point in the past. To try to explain to you really what I mean. The New York Times very proudly shopped out this kind of, several years ago, this sort of map showing where everyone got murdered around New York City. And when you open it up, you're like, God, that looks like a dangerous city. This is crawling with murders, right? Because there's no history here, guys, right? This is like, what is it, 2003 to 2009 all collapsed together. And not only that, if you start looking at these things, you say, okay, month, victim, we have race, ethnicity, perps, the sex, this, the age, that, weapons used, blah, blah, blah. This is the most regressive social categories you can possibly, man, black, woman, white. It's absolutely, absolutely awful. But this is the, quote, data, unquote, the hard facts that the New York Times is busily and very sort of neutrally recording. Then you start to look more closely at this map and you say, well, this part of New York looks really dangerous. Gee, all those murders, right? Okay, but there's a problem with that, and that is that if we use the very same instrument that they're using as the base layer, which is Google Maps, and you go a little bit closer than the New York Times thing allows you to do, you'll begin to start to see building massing, right? You'll start to see elevations of these kinds of things, and you'll start to see much more complex social spaces, and you gradually begin to realize that all of those murders did not take place on the street, that in some cases they took place on the 22nd floor. It might have been, for example, domestic violence or something like that. Right? And that this really isn't a question of real estate properties, that instead, underneath every single one of those blue dots, if you lift it up, comes crawling out all these nasty discourses, race, gender, politics, class, and so on. But they've been reduced, flattened to little blue dots. And then you start looking even more closely, and you'll see, for example, like, this guy, what's his name, Muhammad Afzal. Supposedly, he died where I think that blue dot is. In fact, he did not. He died more closely where that red dot is, but the reason that they moved him was that the New York Police Department, which provided the data, always record the address of where a body was found. But there's no addresses in parks, right? So they move him out to the outside. And you see this kind of violence. The guy was homeless in life and, amazingly enough, homeless in death, and very much, attributable to the same kind of apparatus that made that happen. Here's another fine example that I just saw float by. I was unaware of before. This purports to be a map of every war that took place between the year 0 and 2012. It's amazing how similar all those wars are. You'd think that over a course of 2,000 years they would have changed slightly. Little things like sieges, Polynesian warfare, whatever, African, blah blah war. And you look at this and you say, well, okay, I can work with that. You guys are doing some sort of GIS-related coordinate system. But then when you start to look more closely at it, you'll see very strange things. For example, kind of in the bottom center, that apparently the siege of Waco counts as a war, whereas genocide of like First Nations and Native Americans doesn't. Right? I mean, this is becoming actually shocking. This is becoming shocking and offensive. So that's kind of what I was getting at. Now, to understand this, I'm going to walk through a couple of books that I think are vitally important, and I really recommend that all of you take a look at. I think that these are two astounding and beautiful books, and I'm also quite fond of this slide. The slide's good, the colors are quite fantastic. On the left, Techniques of the Observer by Jonathan Crary. I had the honor to write the index for it, so there you go. And Rivers of Shadow by Rebecca Solnit. These are two very different approaches to understanding the relationship between a kind of technical apparatus of visualization or kind of envisioning on the one hand, with subjectivity on the one hand, and with sort of like our landscape and our conceptual world on the other. They take very different approaches, but they're sort of tackling the same kind of problem. And it's basically that the way that we understand ourselves and the way that we make our world is intimately bound up with the tools that we use to see the world around us. And I'll show you what I mean. I don't remember which of this is. Is it zoetrope, phenakistoscope, kinetoscope, praxinoscope, whatever. There's a bunch of these scopes, right? And we're sort of bourgeois optical amusements. Really sort of fascinating things. In many ways, I would argue that data visualization is itself the latest in this sort of long line of bourgeois optical amusements, the devices for the parlor. But I can't really justify that, at least in this short talk. And you'll see again these sort of strange procession of devices that proceed by taking sort of isolated slices and turning them into a sequence. and that you need to assemble that sequence of sort of like slices or objects in order to compose a sort of a meta sense, and it requires, it relies on our sort of optical behavior and our cognition. This is a very famous example of Edward Muybridge's photo. It was generated in a debate. It was sponsored by a bottom, you'll see, Leyland Stanford wanted to know, he had a bet going with some of his pals about whether or not all 4 feet of a horse left the ground when it was galloping. Muybridge set out to sort of solve that problem, and in the process, as Rebecca Solnit makes very clear, basically laid the technical basis for demolishing space-time and the entire west of the United States, and not in an abstract sense. That the machinic quality for disassembling and reconstructing space that went on, that he was a part of, was very closely related to the development of trains, which consumed enormous amounts of lumber that were cut down and sort of flattened and transformed the West. Another photograph by Muybridge that shows you something that in many ways is a data visualization, but what could be more analog than the flight of a bird. Right? You see the use of a coordinate system to begin to stabilize phenomena, but these are not informatic, these are not digital, these are not binary computations at all. Instead, there's a very different way of composing sense. Information does not cause these kinds of things. Information comes from these things. People have the whole story of information backwards. This is a photograph by Etienne Jules Moret, who was a French photographer and brainiac who developed a photographic gun that he started pointing at birds and things like that in order to figure out what's going on. And in the process produced, I think, some of the most sort of breathtaking images. You can stare at these things and go, so very much about the world. This is not information. It is not, and it will never be. You can find the coordinate systems in there very clearly, but yet there's something else going on. We can find other examples of it. This is Frank Gilbreth. Have any of you ever seen or heard of something called Cheaper by the Dozen? It's film, book, whatever. This is the Frank Gilbreth of the Gilbreth family, who concluded